in the need to feed ourselves during the Second World War, to go from importing 75% of our food, which is what we were when the war started, to fairly shortly afterwards, only 6 short years, supplying 75% of our food, we had to take drastic measures. And I think what the majority of farmers now concede is that the unintended consequences of those measures are patently clear, and we need to address them fast. But what I have seen all over the country is how quickly this can be done, how quickly the land can be regenerated whilst also producing food.
They're rarely hailed now as they once were in the post-war years, when they were seen as heroes, charged with feeding a hungry nation. Well, one writer, former barrister, and now farmer really, has found herself moving from her city life to return to her farming roots. She spent the past few years travelling the country, hearing from farmers, both about their plight and their ingenuity in the face of the challenges they are facing. This is all for her book, Rooted: Stories of Life, Land and a Farming Revolution. Sarah Langford, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you very much for having me.
Tell us, first of all, why you wanted to dedicate your time to this, why you wanted so much to tell the farmers' stories.
It was an accident, I've got to be honest. I wrote a book called In Your Defence, which was about my time as a criminal and family barrister, which is really how I've spent my kind of adult career so far. And those who were keen for me to do a follow-up were very keen for me to do crime fiction. But what happened, this is really the story of actually what happened next, because while I was writing that book, my husband lost his job in 2017. We had 2 small children, an 8-month-old baby and a 2-year-old. And we decided to leave London for a bit, which is where we've been living for the last decade, and move to Suffolk, where he grew up, as a respite, really. It was supposed to be for 6 months. It did not turn out that way. But we took on the running of his small family farm in a part of the country which was opposite to where I grew up, in Hampshire, on the other side of the country. And it was really then that I realised that I had accidentally become a farmer at one of the biggest crossroads that agriculture has seen in multiple generations. The subsidies which had supported food production for so long were going as a result of Brexit. As you just referenced, a huge transition had really taken place in how farmers were perceived around the world. And I had to really work out if there was really a future in farming at all in Britain. And that was what led me to travel around the country and talk to farmers from all sorts of walks of life, from arable to dairy, and find out what was really happening on the ground. And it was then that I realized that there was this quiet revolution happening in pockets all over the countryside, precipitated by a number of events, a regenerative farming revolution that was changing how farmers were growing food, but also how they were treating their land, how they saw themselves, how they saw their farms and communities. And I thought that this was so opposite to the message that I was so often getting in the city, that the people who really we never heard from, their stories deserve to be told. So Rooted is really a combination of my story. It's part memoir of what happened in Suffolk and what we did what we're doing in our farm in Suffolk, and the stories of the farmers that had, I suppose, the most profound impact on me, and not just how I saw farming, but genuinely how I saw myself, how I saw the world and my connection to it. And sorry.
No, I was going to say, as you say, it's your story, and your family story really tells the wider story of what's happening to farming in the last few decades that I was alluding to in my introduction. So I wonder if you could just explain the story really of what it was to be a farmer when your grandfather was a farmer, and the huge difference in what it was to be a farmer when then your uncle took over.
Yeah. So you're right. It wasn't a world necessarily that was completely new to me, although my adult life had been spent in the city because as an 80s kid, that's where we thought we should all end up if we wanted to do important things. The opposite turned out to be true, I think. My grandfather was a post-war farmer, so he began his farming career, I guess, as when the war began in 1939, and he got his first tenancy in the 50s. So he was very clear about his position. It was to feed the world in whatever way he could, using whatever methods he could. And he was encouraged to do it, paid to do it, admired by his government and his community for doing that. He was a very well-respected farmer, even though he never owned his own land. He was a tenant farmer. But he died absolutely sure of his place as hero. One generation later, my uncle became a farmer at the age of 23 in very different circumstances, and soon found himself accused of ecological mismanagement. And the goalposts had been moved very quickly. And I wanted to figure out how we went from hero to villain so fast and where we were going next. And I realized that in my own family history, there is this parable of modern farming. And I hope that now I'm able to take on the next step and go into this new generation of regenerative farming.
Tell us, and there's so much to talk about, and there's such a huge so many farmers doing so many different things. It's really interesting, your relationship with your uncle, which I think epitomizes so much of this difficulty at the moment with people, you who are environmentally conscious, want to preserve soil, ecosystems, and you have this, I'm sure your uncle clearly loves all these things too,
Yeah.
but he's angry. He's being told he's destroying his soil. He's being, words like destruction are being used towards him. And he's just doing what he was told to do as a farmer. But it's really difficult because there's a generation, I probably count myself with you, we want to protect the soil. We hear awful stories about how much wildlife is disappearing. How do you get that balance right between the old and the new?
I think genuinely that is what regenerative farming is doing. It is total hubris to think that any of this is new. Some of the techniques that regenerative farmers are using to try and regenerate their soils, integrating livestock into arable rotations, for example, so using sheep to graze off wheat to take the disease off rather than spraying it with fungicide. Those are techniques that our great-great-grandparents would have recognized. And good husbandry, integrating a diversity of crops rather than just monocultures, all of these are old techniques, as is the idea of the soil as a living thing. In 1943, Balfour, a farmer, a pretty smart farmer, admittedly, but a farmer nonetheless, wrote a book called The Living Soil. We've known these lessons for a long time, but in the need to feed ourselves during the Second World War, to go from importing 75% of our food, which is what we were when the war started, to fairly shortly afterwards, only 6 short years, supplying 75% of our food, we had to take drastic measures. And I think what the majority of farmers now concede is that the unintended consequences of those measures are patently clear, and we need to address them fast. But what I have seen all over the country is how quickly this can be done, how quickly the land can be regenerated whilst also producing food. It feels very, I've just got back from a 2-day farming festival called Groundswell, which is the Glastonbury of agriculture. And it's hard to underestimate how kind of buoyant the mood is and how the ideas that people are sharing are doing so with such generosity and curiosity.
I've been seeing actually pictures of Groundswell. It does look like the alternative Glastonbury, a huge festival, and it really does show exactly as you say this change in attitude, and that is a positive thing. We're looking for some positives amidst lots of quite negative news and headlines and lots of challenges for farmers. But there's so many wonderful stories, and they're all included, of course, in Rooted: Stories of Life, Land, and a Farming Revolution, which I think is not quite out yet, is it?
It's not out yet. We had some pre-release copies at Groundswell, but it's out on the 7th of July.
Okay. Well, Sarah Langford, thank you very much indeed for joining us to talk about it on Times Radio. Now, a similar sort of a story for this coming up after the trail. This is Hannah McInnes on Times Radio in association with Yesterday TV for Curious Minds.